Hey class, this is Kristen. We are going to use After Effects today to composite some frame-by-frame animation hand-painted in the Photoshop timeline with some background elements and other scene elements here in After Effects. We'll make a new project, and before we do anything, let's set up our organization. We'll make a folder called Elements. This is where we import everything into this folder. And then we'll make a second folder called comps. Comps is short for composition, which is the main building block in After Effects. So let's now set up a new new composition. We can use this little icon here, or the comp is represented by this little multicolored film frame here in the bottom of the project panel. Our composition settings should match what we need for class delivery, which is HDTV 1080 24, which stands for 1920 by 1080, square pixels, and frame rate 24. You can set your duration here. I'll keep mine at 3 seconds. And then we can also name it here. This will be our main scene. I like to always label it main, and then whatever the scene is called. This is my ball scene. All right, if it's the main comp, I like to leave that on the outside. And then at any given moment, I can just close these two folders and everything is just neatly tucked away with what is clearly my main comp hanging out here. So let's import our Photoshop file. I can go up to File, Import, of course, and notice there's many importing options here. Or I can just use the shortcut, which is selecting the folder I want to import to and then hitting Command I. Navigate to your hard drive. So here's the folder where I created the Harmony rough animation for my bowling ball. I did the timing in Harmony, and then I brought it into Photoshop where I used the timeline in Photoshop and I hand painted my animation. I created background layers, foreground layers, all of that I set up in Photoshop. You can see that my project or my assignment folder on my hard drive also mimics my folder structure here in After Effects. So I will be saving the next version of my After Effects project here in Projects folder, and my Photoshop file and anything else I might be importing is just tucked away inside this Elements folder. If I move this Photoshop file somewhere else after importing it into After Effects won't be able to find it. So you just need to be organized and keep things in the same place. Later when we export our scene, that can just live out here because we won't be making too many different versions of the exports. But if you're exporting many different versions, you might also want to put those in a folder also. So let's bring in our Photoshop file. Now, there's some import options here that are going to be pretty important. Because we want to retain all of the separate layers and video groups from Photoshop, we want to import that as a composition, not as footage. So let's do composition, retain layer sizes. And if you don't see these options, look for this options button here. So let's import this Photoshop file as a comp. And we get another option here. This will allow you to adjust any filters that you may have placed in Photoshop and make continued adjustments in After Effects. But I'm just going to merge all of my effects and layer styles from Photoshop and just bring it merged and just cleanly flattened into After Effects. All right, let's see what we have here. So I imported this into my Elements folder, even though my Photoshop file came in as a comp on its own. Let's double click that comp. This should look familiar. This should look exactly like it does in Photoshop. Also, you can see each Photoshop layer was brought in as its own separate layered artwork here in After Effects. So we can close this layer folder for now, and let's just deal with this ball scene. Now, up here is the footage panel, so whenever you double click on a layer, it'll show up in this footage panel. But the composition panel is what will show us the entire scene. Now, remember, we have a main scene going on, and also when we did our Photoshop timeline, we had created an extra large canvas. So if we go to composition settings here, right, this is not 1920 by 1080. We increased the size and we created larger artwork because we were going to be adding some camera moves here in After Effects. So we need to make sure our artwork will be big enough. Let's go back to our main comp and bring in our ball scene here. And now we'll see what's happening. Our main comp, and to check the comp settings, just hit Command K. Our main comp was set up to be our class delivery 1920 by 1080. So you can see when we select this ball comp, it's showing the extra artwork. It's kind of cropping it to where we just need to be, which is 1920 by 1080. So this gives us extra artwork in the margins to play with camera moves. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Each layer in After Effects has 5 transform properties: the anchor point, the position, scale, rotation, and opacity. So whenever you see the stopwatch next to it, that means you can keyframe it. You can add animation to that layer with that property. So as a quick demonstration, let's turn on the stopwatch for the rotation attribute, and then maybe 1 second down the line, we can rotate it 180 degrees. And then now when we play it, right, After Effects is going to interpolate between my 2 keyframes from 0 to 180. Sometimes I like to keep transparency turned on just so I know that there's actually nothing in the background if I'm going to rotate my Photoshop document like this. If I wanted to just erase all of the keyframes, then I will press this stopwatch. So let's go inside and let's start setting this up for compositing. So I had made a little guide for myself here, 1920 by 1080. I'm going to come back out to the main scene and just kind of line it up here. And then we can turn that off. My rough animation still exists in here, but I really don't need it, so I can leave that off. I can shift click those, just drag those to the bottom. And then this is white. To rename a layer, you can select on a layer and then just hit enter or return. And then if you right click, reveal in layer source, it'll show you where it is in your elements folder. And you'll see that I didn't change the name in the original. So this can be good and quick just to label and relabel things as things change in your comp. So let's go back to our comp window. We're going to add a camera now and start working with some 3D layers. So let's go up to Layer, New, Camera. And it tells you camera and lights don't affect 2D layers, and so we just need to set some of our layers to be 3D. Great, that's what we're just about to do. So I'm going to set as 3D any layer that I want to be affected by this multi-plane move that we're going to do. So I'm going to turn foreground line, and here's my solo. Let me turn this transparency on, use the solo button, and now it'll only show me that layer, right? So I want both of my foreground layers. Turn that 3D, so I'll turn on this switch, looks like a little cube. If you don't see these switches, come down to the bottom of this column and it'll say toggle between switches and modes. And modes is going to be similar to the layer modes in Photoshop. So why don't we could try setting that to multiply. What else do we want as 3D? Let's definitely set our animation to be 3D, our ball. And then I've got 3 layers to my background, so I'll turn those on 3D. And let's leave the ground as a 2D layer for now. We can always turn it on for 3D later. Now, let's rearrange our view in the comp window to set us up for animating this camera move. Just a few notes here. I can turn off guides and that'll clear up my space a little bit. All right, let's select in the bottom right, let's set this to 2 views. Now, I have to turn off guides again. All right, now this shows me 2 different views of this same comp, the same Photoshop document. First is my active camera view, and then the second is a left view of the scene. I can change that to top view however I want. I like looking at it from the side. So here is my camera. Let me hold down spacebar and drag this over so you can see. Here's my camera, and what the camera is seeing is represented by this triangle area. So right now, all of our layers, if you can see, represented by this axis, all of the layers are lined up on top of each other. They're totally flat. They have no like width. Now, because we set them to 3D, that means we can start moving them around in 3D space. So we want to use this Z axis. Just hover over the Z and pull out these layers. Now look what happens in my live camera view when I move things in Z space. It's as if it's getting closer to the camera. So let me undo that and let me actually connect the foreground layers together. I'm going to look for this pick whip. It looks like a little spiral in the parent and link column. And I want to actually link my my foreground paint layer to its line layer. I just have 2 layers of foreground that I want to act as one. So I'm going to parent my paint layer to my line layer just by dragging over from the pick whip to the layer I want to parent it to. And now when I move it or when I rotate it, both layers will be moving together. So plus and minus on the number keypad is a shortcut for rotation. But once I've parented it, I don't really need to think much about this anymore, so I can just even temporarily hide it away. Turn on this little shy guy switch, and then up here in my timeline, I can just turn that on. And I can even hide my 1920 by 1080 guide layer and my rough animation layer too. So now I don't have a cluttered view. Okay, let's come back to moving our layers around in Z space. This is just something to note. Because I animated in 1920 by 1080 size, I don't really want to be moving this layer too much around in Z space, because then I might see the edges of the artwork. So I'm actually going to leave my animation right where it is, right here in the middle, move the foreground layers in front of it and in back of it. Here, now you can see here's where my foreground layer is, here's my animation ball layer. Now I can move the background layers. Anything that's 3D, I will be able to move in this view. So I'm going to select all those, grab the Z axis, which is represented with blue, and then just push that back. Now remember, I can't push too far back, because if I come out to my main scene, right, I'll start to see the edges of my artwork. So we can kind of flip between these two comps and line it up. So let's do that. And then I can move these layers around too in my active camera view. All right, so let's double check how this is looking. All right, I want to pull that over, and my foreground has completely disappeared, so I'm going to move that up. Now, the further apart these layers are in 3D space on the z-axis, the more apparent this parallax effect will be. Um, but sometimes we just need a subtle feeling of depth. We don't need anything too crazy. Okay, we can make some of these adjustments later. All right, now let's place some keyframes on the camera. We can begin to block out our scene. These tools here are for using the camera and for moving the camera around the scene. This one will orbit around. Now we can see like, oh, we can see where our layers are in relation, and you can see how this camera in my side view is also moving it around and showing what my view is. Let me just undo that. And then here we can kind of move up and down and to the side, panning around our scene. So I can use that and just move everything up slightly. Check my main view. Okay, that's better. And then I can also use this tool to zoom in and out, or to track in and out of my scene. So let's set up the first position of our camera. It's going to be slightly zoomed out, maybe even more. As much as I have artwork for. Okay, that's a little too much. All right, let's start there. All right, let's lock down this position now with some keyframes. On the camera layer, you want to keyframe the point of interest and the position. Now let's go to our second point. So I think I'm going to have this camera kind of zoom in, take us into this scene, and then try to follow the ball before it rolls away. So my animation comes up to about 2.5 seconds, but my scene can last a little bit longer. So let's try this. By this point, I think the camera is going to zoom in. I want to follow and focus on that ball. And then you'll see that it automatically made keyframes at that position since I set up keyframes at the beginning. And then by the time we get to 3 seconds, I want the camera to be trying to follow and trail the ball to the edge. So like this. Okay. Now you can kind of see where my scene is breaking at the seams, right? This ground layer, let me come in here. This ground layer, we did not make a 3D layer. So I think now is a good time to do that. Let's just line it up at the beginning where nothing's breaking yet. Let's turn that into a 3D layer at this point in time. And I don't need to move it in Z space. I'm going to keep it lined up with just where my animation is. Okay, now that it's a 3D layer, it'll move with the camera and we don't see that seam. Okay. Now, I'm not getting too much of a parallax effect on my background. I think that's just because my colors are too close together. So let me toggle this to layer modes and let me just play around with some of that. See how this feels. Okay. So you can kind of see the parallax effect, that multiplaning effect, when I start panning the camera. Now, with just a few keyframes on my camera layer, I'm going to press U to show keyframes, and turning our Photoshop layers 3D here, we have very easily created more of a mood in our scene. Now we are slowly kind of zooming in, and it just makes it feel like there's someone watching this ball, right? Because of the foreground layers, the ball is partially obscured, and the camera's following it. So adding camera moves definitely look cool, but you can use that as a director to direct the audience's attention as well as to create a subjective point of view. All right, but we're not done yet. Let's keep adding to our scene in After Effects. All right, I'm okay with setting up my layers now. I'm going to switch this back to working in one view. Now, I'm going to move my animation layer up just a tiny bit because it's obscured by the bushes for most of the time. The reason why this edge is showing through is because I multiplied only that layer. I can change this to a different one. Oops. Oh, I have to unhide it. Let's make a little reflection kind of shadow for the ball. let's take our animation layer and we're going to duplicate that with it selected, Command D. Now I have two balls, and before we get too far, I'm just going to rename this ball shadow so I don't get confused what's what. And then I want to rotate this 180 degrees. I don't need to set a keyframe. I'm just moving it around. And then now I want to line it up to where it touches the ground on my regular animation. So when it lands here at this frame here, I'm just using page up and page down on my keyboard, on my extended keyboard, to go frame by frame. If you're working on a laptop, you have to press Command arrow to go back and forth frame by frame. Okay, here's where it contacts the ground, right here. So let's take my shadow, and I already turned it upside down. Let's position it. So I'll hit P for position, and then on the y-axis, or this green arrow here, let me just line it up. Okay, does that work? Yeah, that does. Okay, it overlaps a little bit here. Let me just pull that down more. There we go. Okay, now it has this little mirrored reflection going on. And we can turn this into a shadow or an actual literal reflection. So before we get too far, let's turn the opacity down. T for opacity. Just so we can remember. Okay, that's our shadow layer or our reflection layer. Let's just try it at 30% for now. And then let's unsolo all of our layers and see how it's looking in the scene. Okay, as far as opacity goes, that feels all right to me for now. Now, let's add a feather mask to the shadow layer, because we can't see the full shape. We wouldn't, in real life, we wouldn't be able to see the full shape of this shadow. So let's just obscure it partially. So sometimes it helps me to just solo the layers I need to look at. And I'm going to select my shadow, which is going to be here. And then I'll just take this rectangle tool, and I want to draw a rectangle just around part of that shadow here and obscuring the rest, like so. And then to make it feel just a little bit more natural, right? Because this is going to be a hard edge. If we go into our shadow layer, that mask just created a new attribute layer for us. See, all of this is tucked inside. Here's my regular transform attributes, but now my mask has its own set of attributes that I can adjust. And keyframe too. But I'm not going to keyframe that. I'm just going to feather the mask a tiny bit so that the edge is a little bit more gradual. And I'm going to adjust the expansion this way. When it comes to compositing environmental elements, especially like shadows, lighting, um, it's a little tempting to kind of show off and just make everything super obvious, but it's really the subtle touches that an audience might not notice, but they'll feel it. And it's those subtle environmental touches that'll really kind of bring the scene to life and create this other world. Let's look in our main scene, see how that's moving. I'll just press spacebar. All right, and finally, why don't we add some Why don't we add some effects and filters to our scene and just bump that up. So let's go to our effects controls panel for our ball shadow. And then let's come to our effects and presets library here. I want to darken that reflection a little bit and make it less orange. Let's look for brightness and contrast here. I'll just drag that to my ball file, and I just want to bring that brightness down, maybe even bring the contrast down just a bit. And if I say I didn't want like a reflection effect, say I wanted just a straight up shadow, I would just go to hue saturation and I would turn lightness all the way down. I could turn the saturation down too. And then don't forget that we have opacity turned on this layer, so we can also further adjust that. But I do like having a little bit of this orange color, making it feel like it's a reflection or it's landing on the glossy surface. So I'll just delete hue and saturation. But as you can see, you can stack effects here on any given layer. Let's add a little bit of blur on this reflection. So let's come back to effects. Let's type in blur, see what's there. Gaussian blur is a good one. So we can increase that. Yeah, there. And you can see even on the effects, every attribute that has a stopwatch next to it means that you can keyframe it. You can add animation to these effects. Okay, that's subtle, but again, it's those subtle touches that really kind of makes the audience believe and just enter your world. Now I want to add some blur on my foreground to mimic what is out of focus when I am zooming around with my camera lens. So let's use a lens blur for this. Let's try just typing lens blur. Here we go, camera lens blur. So I'm going to pull that onto my foreground layer, and I can adjust how much. Now, because I had the foreground on 2 layers, I can apply lens blur to both layers, or I can group my foreground layers together and then just apply the lens blur on top of that grouping. So I'm going to cut this effect and then we'll paste it later. Before we do that, let's select both foreground layers and we're going to pre-comp this, pre-compose. So what that means is that we're going to make a new composition, or what is called a pre-comp, because it's going to be a composition within a composition. So I'll just call this foreground, and I have 2 options here. Right now I only have this one option to move everything into the new comp. So if I had any keyframes, all of that would get moved inside that new comp. Now here is my new foreground comp. If I double click that, then inside I'll be able to see what's going on in there. So inside, my layer mode is preserved. I set it to multiply instead of normal. When I come back out here, and I can use this little button, this is the flow chart, to help me navigate in and out of nested comps. Also, since we had just created a new comp, let's just come back here and organize ourselves. So this foreground comp is something that we made rather than imported. So I just like to separate that out into a separate comps folder. I need to turn on this switch, and this will allow whatever settings inside this comp to show through one level out. And I also need to make this a 3D layer. I'll turn that 3D at the beginning of my scene where everything is still lined up. Okay, now let's just check. Okay, so now that we pre-comped both foreground layers, we can paste that camera lens effect back onto this pre-comp, and now it'll affect both foreground layers. So I'm going to actually keyframe this blur radius attribute, turn on the stopwatch, and then in my timeline hit U to reveal where that keyframe is. And I'm going to kind of line it up with the camera move. So from here, let's make that maybe blur it like this. And we could even animate blur on those background layers too. Let's add an ease on this keyframe here. So I'm selecting the keyframes, and then I'm right clicking, and then we want to go to keyframe assistant, just easy ease. That means it'll just feel a little bit smoother as the camera changes direction. And if I wanted to really control how this camera is moving, then we can come to this graph editor button. And if I select the camera, select the attribute, shift select, then I can even play with these points. So let's render. Oh, and this whole time I didn't even save my project. For shame. Let's do that now. I'll make this version 2. Also, you'll notice that my autosave is going directly to my hard drive. Autosave. Autosave location is next to my project. All right, let's render our main comp. We'll go up to Composition, Add to Render Queue. All of these blue links mean that you can change those settings. So we should double check. We want the best quality, full resolution, 1920 by 1080. Our work area, we didn't change our work area. I know that my main comp is set to 3 seconds. So I can leave it at that. Just make sure this is coming out at 24 frames per second. Under Output Module, let's make sure this is coming out as a QuickTime movie with the format as Apple ProRes 422HQ. We don't have audio in the scene, but we have a few settings to control that down here. And then finally, Output 2, we will name this. And we'll call this ball scene version 2. And then save. Whoops, come back to the render queue tab. And then we can either send it to Adobe Media Encoder, or we can just render it from After Effects. So let's press this. And depending on how fast your computer is, that's how long it'll take to render. Shortcut is to turn on the caps lock on your keyboard, and instead of showing you a preview of every frame that After Effects is creating, it'll just do that in the background. And this does speed up the render process just a little bit. And then let's go to our hard drive. We can also save our project and then quit out of it. Let's go to our hard drive. And here is our rendered scene.